are voices the world doesn't expect to hear, not because they're confused or weak, but because they come from mouths nobody considers authoritative. Voices that are too young, too humble, too unexpected for the place where they appear. History tends to treat those voices in one of two ways. It ignores them until it can't anymore, or it destroys them before they become too inconvenient. Sometimes it does both, and the voice remains anyway. Joan of Arc was about 17 years old when she stood before the Dauphin of France and told him that God had sent her to save his kingdom. She had no noble blood, no sword of her own, no military training, no title that gave her the right to speak in those terms. She was the daughter of peasants from Domremy, a small village in northeastern France that today barely appears on maps. She grew up among fields and animals, in the slow rhythm of a life with no visible ambitions. She learned to spin and to pray. She never learned to read or write, but she claimed to have heard something that completely changed the course of her life. France in 1412, the likely year of Joan's birth, was a broken country. The 100 Years' War had been consuming territories, harvests, and generations for decades. It wasn't a clean or distant war. It was constant pressure, a slow bleeding that divided families, villages, and entire regions. The English controlled the north. The Burgundians, a powerful faction of the French nobility, were allied with them. The Dauphin Charles, the legitimate heir to the throne, had never been crowned, and his right to rule was openly challenged. France wasn't just losing land, it was losing its certainty that it could survive as a unified kingdom. Joan grew up inside that reality. The war wasn't a distant story for her. It was the backdrop of her childhood, the rumor that arrived with refugees, the shadow that fell over entire villages. And it was within that world that she began to hear voices. She described them as voices accompanied by light, which she identified as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. She didn't interpret them as fantasies or vague impressions. She understood them as a concrete calling, with specific instructions and a mission that left no room for doubt. She had to go to the Dauphin Charles, convince him to trust her guidance, and help lift the English siege of Orleans so he could be crowned King of France in Reims. It's hard to grasp today just how enormous that was, not only because of what the mission demanded, but because of who was being asked to carry it. A young woman with no power, no recognizable name, no access to the structures that made military or political decisions. To reach Chinon, where the Dauphin was staying, she needed to cross hostile territory, find an escort, and get someone to actually listen to her without immediately dismissing her as delusional or as someone else's pawn. What she needed, at the most basic level, was for other people to believe something she had no conventional way of proving. She arrived in Chinon in February of 1429. What happened there is one of those moments where personal history and public history intersect in a way that's hard to explain through material causes alone. Charles received her. They spoke privately. No one knows exactly what was said, but the result was that the Dauphin gave her enough credibility to move forward. She was subjected to a theological examination in Poitiers, where a group of clergy checked for any signs of deception or heresy. She passed. She was given armor, a horse, a standard. She was given a place in the army. That a young peasant woman had come this far was already extraordinary. But what followed in Orleans turned it into something that shaped the memory of an entire nation. The siege of Orleans had gone unresolved for months. The French army was worn down, morale was low, and losing the city would have been a blow that nearly any hope of French recovery could not have survived. Joan arrived in April of 1429. She didn't take command in the strict sense, but her presence did something that's difficult to measure precisely. It changed the disposition of the people fighting. The siege was lifted in May. For the French, that wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a sign that something had shifted in the course of the war, and that sign mattered just as much as the victory itself. What followed was a march toward Reims, the city where tradition required the kings of France to be crowned. Joan accompanied that journey, took part in several battles, and became a figure nobody involved in the conflict could afford to ignore. For the French people, she had become a sign of divine favor. For the English and their allies, she was a real threat. For the French nobility and clergy, she was someone nobody quite knew what to do with. Charles VII was crowned in Reims in July of 1429. Joan was there, holding her standard. She had fulfilled the central part of what she believed God had asked of her. But Joan's story didn't end in Reims. Political power tends to make use of people when they're useful, and let them go without much hesitation when they become complicated or inconvenient. Joan continued taking part in military campaigns, but royal support grew thinner. In May of 1430, during combat near Compiègne, she was captured by Burgundian forces. The Burgundians sold her to the English, and the English had very concrete reasons to want Joan gone, or at least to stop being a source of credibility for the French side. The trial that began in Rouen in 1431 was not a search for truth. It was a process built to produce a conviction. The charges were heresy and witchcraft, framed in ways that made an effective defense nearly impossible. Joan faced that trial alone, without a lawyer, without support from the king she had helped crown, interrogated by clergy who were skilled in theological argument and knew she lacked the academic tools to counter them. They pressured her to recant her voices, to admit she had been deceived by the devil, to take back what she had held for years as the deepest certainty of her life. The pressure was sustained, systematic, and deliberate. At one point in the process, Joan signed an abjuration. It was an understandable moment of human collapse. She was 19 years old, alone, terrified, and she had been promised that signing would save her life. But days later she took it back. She returned to what she had always maintained, that her voices were real, that they had come from God, that her mission had been true. That retraction was treated as relapsed heresy. On May 30th, 1431, she was burned at the stake in the market square of Rouen. She was 19 years old. The entire trial had been a political construction disguised as a religious proceeding, and those who condemned her knew it. 25 years later, in 1456, a rehabilitation process ordered by Charles VII himself annulled the conviction. The judges who had signed the sentence were already dead. The review declared the trial null and fundamentally flawed from the beginning. It was a belated recognition, driven in part by political motivations, but it gave Joan her name back. Centuries later, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her. She became one of the most recognized saints in the Christian world and a central figure in French history. Part of why her canonization took so long is that her story didn't fit the usual patterns of sainthood. She wasn't a martyr of the faith in the strict sense. She didn't found a religious order. She didn't write theological texts. Her path was militarily active, politically charged, and deeply controversial. The Church struggled to know what to do with her, much the same way that no one in her lifetime knew quite what to do with a young peasant woman who claimed to receive direct instructions from God. And yet something in her life resisted every attempt to reduce or erase it. What keeps Joan's story alive isn't military success or national symbolism. It's something more uncomfortable and harder to contain. the image of a young person without any visible resources who held an interior conviction with enough consistency to outlast the pressure of power, the fear of death, and the loneliness of an unjust trial. She didn't do it because she was untouchable. She did it while being deeply vulnerable, while being aware of the danger, while being a young woman with no one left to stand behind her. That is what continues to unsettle people. That is what endures. Her story leaves us with a question that has no easy answer. What do you do when an inner voice demands something that no structure of power is willing to accept? Joan didn't wait for permission. She also didn't pretend the cost of not asking for it didn't exist. She moved forward anyway, with the clarity of someone who had understood that certain things cannot be postponed without betraying yourself. The flames in Rouen didn't silence that voice. They left it resonating, young and inconvenient, in the memory of everyone who has ever felt they had something important to say, and couldn't find any sanctioned place from which to say it.